Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law Podcast, brought to you by Digital Law, a law firm that works solely on these issues and law and technology. And this is produced by Anson Evaluate. As a bit of background, in each episode we look at stories in the law related to digital technology from around the world, with an emphasis on data protection and cybersecurity. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law, and I'm joined by my colleague Peter Wright, and we're just going to run through some news stories that have been coming up this week. I'll pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we will get started.
Thank you, Amelia. My name is Peter. I'm a solicitor and the managing director at Digital Law, and looking forward to running through some of the stories that are hot off the press this week that I think are really relevant to our niche in law and technology.
Thanks, Peter. So diving straight into the first story. So we have been looking at TikTok over the last few weeks on a podcast, and today is just about the same. We are looking at Oliver Dowden, and so he has confirmed that TikTok is being banned from all government devices in the UK. This decision followed a security review which found that given the risk to sensitive data and strengthening policy on third-party apps, they would be banning TikTok with immediate effect. These restrictions follow similar moves by the US, Canada, and the European Commissions, and will not apply to the personal device of government officials, but they will apply to all of the standard devices that they are using. This is to protect the security of the sensitive government information, and essentially it's kind of to stop other data extracting apps, and these are being kept under review. So I will pass over to Peter to continue with this.
Thanks, Amelia. I mean, this is just the next step, the next inexorable step on the way towards a increasingly likely ban on the use of TikTok, not just on government devices, but full stop in some countries. I think the UK could be one of those. The reason we're on this path is because of the fears in Western governments that the Chinese Communist Party has access to the data that TikTok is collecting, and their app collects an awful lot of data from your mobile phone. It doesn't just collect data on which videos you're watching. It's going into all of everything from GPS data to your internet searches to looking at numerous bits of analytic data around how you use your phone, what you buy online, who you communicate with, which cell towers it's connecting to. You get the idea. Now, an awful lot of other apps do this as well, but the fear here is that information is then being shared with the Chinese Communist Party if it asks for it under a security law that exists in China. China says, no, we would never ask for that data, but nonetheless, as you've rightly said, Amelia, we've had bans issued by governments, the US federal government, the European Commission, the government in Germany, Denmark, various others around the world are now instituting this ban on public sector devices, saying that those devices provided and paid for by governments should not have TikTok installed on them. This is causing a few embarrassments. For example, there are those in government who use TikTok. There is one minister, Grant Shapps, who uses TikTok regularly to communicate with people under the age of 30. And the problem is, well, there is a problem. He's basically said, I will carry on using this, but I'll be doing it from my personal mobile device, not from my government work device. That's the distinction here. But we're slowly, I think, getting to the point where there might be a ban on people using it on their personal mobile devices as well. In the US, there is now legislation in front of Congress on a bipartisan basis. So both the Democrats and the Republicans have this concern around TikTok. It's one of the few things they actually agree on. So there is a piece of legislation called the Restrict Act, which has been laid before Congress. That will now ping pong between Congress and Senate, but we'll see what happens. That act does not basically say ban TikTok. It gives the power to the president to potentially be able to ban TikTok on national security grounds, given that there are 100 million users of TikTok in the US who are having their data gathered by ByteDance, which is the company that owns TikTok. So if that happens in the US, I then suspect there will be pressure from the US on other countries, in particular members of the Five Eyes network, so Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Britain, to turn around and then similarly ban TikTok, which of course for the hundreds of millions of users who've spent a long time building up accounts and might have hundreds of thousands or millions of views on their videos, that's going to be a fairly dramatic draconian step, because then they will lose the accounts they've spent so much time building, and they will lose the money that they've been getting as a result for putting their content up online. So this is just the next inexorable step along that path, and it remains to be seen how quickly we get to that end point that I've just described. In January, I thought, will it happen this year? I thought on balance it would. We're now in March, and I think it is increasingly likely that we will be seeing this before the end of the year.
Certainly, I think you're right in that, and it's interesting, like you say, Peter. You made that prediction at the start of the year, and we were like, yeah, it's fairly likely, and now it's increasingly week on week. We are seeing more and more countries going through and putting some sort of ban on the use of TikTok. So it'll be interesting to see how this does continue to escalate.
I think it was a major issue with the UK National Cybersecurity Centre was involved in this decision. And it was only the first time this week that someone in government actually sort of referred this to the NCSC and said, what is your view on this? And clearly they came back within 48 hours to say, well, you shouldn't be using it. Now, the key thing to bear in mind here is that it is not for a government agency like the NCSC to set policy, but they have been making it very, very clear what their views are with regards to platforms like WhatsApp and TikTok for a very long time. It's just when the policymakers suddenly wake up to what their own security agency is saying and then thinks, oh, maybe we shouldn't be doing that then, that something actually happens. Unfortunately, this is the way that government works in democracies. So, only a few years after people started using TikTok has the government finally woken up to the risk and taken this step. But the fact now that we are having these bans introduced on security grounds will mean that momentum will now continue to build to say that there is a security risk generally around such rich personal data involving children. That's the key thing here, because it's so popular with children that it's the risk of that data being mined and used by a state that has been marked in the British government's most recent security review not as a threat, but certainly as a risk.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our next story then. This is kind of a step away from the typical tech world that we look at. So this next story looks at the first e-scooter rider to sue over a crash has lost 30,000 claimed injuries after failing to prove that a pothole caused her fall. So in this particular case, the e-scooter ploughed into a pothole in North London in 2020, which allegedly resulted in a broken leg that took nearly 2 years to heal. So the claimant in this case actually admitted that she was operating on an illegal scooter on a public street. And this is potentially what's thought to be the first dispute of this kind to reach the UK courts. And while obviously we could focus on the personal injury claim here, we're going to be looking at how e-scooters are regulated and how this kind of fairly new piece of tech is being widely used in places, and why realistically we need some more regulation when thinking about public use. So I'll pass over to Peter to understand this in more detail.
Thanks, Amelia. I mean, the point here as well, I suppose, is do we need more regulation or do we just need enforcement of the existing regulation? Because scooters like this are banned on UK roads. You are not supposed to use e-scooters on the road unless they are part of an official sanctioned scheme. So i.e., you have to go onto the app to unlock the scooter, to use the scooter, to then drop it off somewhere. And these schemes are now in a number of British cities, including London. And they're increasingly ubiquitous. But the point is that if you go out and buy one, or you receive one as a gift, technically you are not supposed to use them on the road, and they are not road legal. So in this instance, there was someone who was in an accident and received an injury as a result of having hit a pothole. So they ended up suing the local authority. Now, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of the personal injury claim because this ended up going before the judge, and the judge was able to say, I'm not going to agree with the claim, and I'm going to fine for the defendant because there is no evidence that the scooter hit the pothole that she is saying she hit. So that's where the claim falls to the ground. That's where the judge has thrown it out. However, the second limb of the defence that the local authority ran was to say, well, she shouldn't have been on the scooter anyway because it was her own scooter and not road legal. But the judge then quite explicitly said, I'm not going to consider that point because I'm getting rid of this claim based on the first point in the defence, which is we can't prove that this was the pothole she actually hit, so we can't prove it's the local authority's fault. Hence, we are not putting the claim through. So unfortunately, despite the headline on this claim that suggests it was bringing some clarity to the situation of are scooters legal on the road and what happens if you're in an accident, it brings no clarity there at all. So we are still waiting for that sort of test case that says, here is an accident, here is the person that was at fault, be it a local authority, a driver, whatever, and then actually saying, could you actually claim damages for being in an accident that causes you an injury based on you being on an e-scooter, even if you were on that e-scooter and it wasn't road legal. So that sort of rock and immovable object, we have yet to have that discussion and a decision in court, and we're still waiting for that to happen. In the meantime, these scooters remain illegal to use on the road. However, the police are not actively enforcing against their use. So that's why people are happily going along and thinking, oh, I went past a policeman and he didn't say anything about it, so it must be all right. No, they just aren't actively doing it, because if they did, I mean, there's various things that would be nice if the police did, like, investigating burglaries and things. But still, the point is that they're just basically saying that, look, there's so much use of these things that we couldn't spend all of our time out there trying to then enforce against the use of these scooters. So that's kind of where we are. You shouldn't be using them on the road, and we still don't know what the consequences are of using them on the road because the police aren't enforcing them. We don't know what happens in terms of legal liability if you either are in or you cause an accident.
Thanks, Peter. Sticking with the theme of legislation, we are next moving to the UK's online safety bill. So I feel like you even said it, Peter, when I spoke to you about this earlier. You was like, oh, again, we're still on this. And yes, we are in fact still going through Parliament with the online safety bill. So allegedly the government says, with a straight face, might I add, that they want to protect the children and install backdoors into end-to-end encryption, essentially removing safety features, but it does not compromise safety. So it seems to be a bit of an oxymoron there. Peter, by your face, I can even see here that you're bursting to get into this. So I will pass over to you.
Well, it's actually a fairly quick one to cover, because the sad truth here is that this is a bill that is kind of born of the wish to say we have to protect your freedoms by taking away your freedoms. And that simply isn't sustainable. It's the fact that this thing is still, rolling around is because there are a number of different things contained inside it that the government would like to have introduced, and indeed arguably should be introduced. But when it comes to this particular aspect in terms of encryption, the current wording of the online safety bill suggests that apps like Signal and WhatsApp, which provide encrypted communications platforms for their users, the government is saying, well, we need to have access to this in order to see if you're sharing illicit images, or perpetrating child abuse, or commissioning terrorist offences, or sharing the plans on how to 3D print a gun and all this sort of stuff. They're wanting to say, oh well, we need to see this because we're the government. And the problem is that actually some of these encrypted platforms are actually used by professions and industries where they have to use secure communications to maintain their professional requirements of confidentiality. So to then say, well, you shouldn't be using them, and indeed the government can then look at it, well, how are you supposed to then maintain the integrity of those duties of confidentiality if the government can look at it? So there is a real problem there with regards to targeting these platforms. The second is that to say that, we need to have access cannot be practically granted in reality. Certainly not when it comes to Signal, because Signal is an app that's installed on a phone by two users, and then they communicate securely through Signal. There is no third-party server. So how they're then saying, oh, well, we want to be able to get in or have some sort of backdoor through. In the real world, that doesn't really work. So the point is that the government's asking for something here that isn't particularly easy to deliver, and all it will succeed in doing is potentially pushing WhatsApp, Signal, and other secure communications apps out of the UK market. Simple as. So when the government's stated aim is to sort of turn the UK into this sort of tech superpower, an innovation hub, bits of legislation like this are not the way to do it. So they've got to be able to balance their need here to be able to demonstrate that they are looking after security issues around the sharing of these sorts of images and damaging content, but it's throwing out baby with bathwater is the problem, and potentially introducing something that is so draconian it places the UK not within the international community, but almost sort of outside, at being at the extremity and saying this stuff isn't allowed. I mean, it's authoritarian states that tend to have a problem with this sort of stuff. The states that aren't democracies that tend to be the ones that say we don't want people talking privately to each other because they might say things that don't agree with the regime. That tends to be the sort of country associated with this sort of action, not the UK. So if we want to become an outlier, this is how you do it.
Thanks, Peter. Moving on to our final story of today. So this story, we're looking at AI and ChatGPT. So a new and improved version of ChatGPT has been unveiled that can be a personal tutor to students and recommend recipes based on a picture from the inside of your fridge. So GPT-4 has been released by OpenAI, which is a US startup backed by Microsoft, and this promises the new technology will be more powerful, creative, and collaborative than its predecessor. So it is currently only available to paying customers of ChatGPT Plus, which is around $20 a month. Microsoft announced that it currently powers the new version of the Bing search engine. This is fairly interesting. I know, Peter, we've been playing around with ChatGPT this week, and I believe that you got it to write a few different bios. So I'll pass over you to explain how we can be using this and why this is so important.
Thanks, Amelia. So yeah, we've used ChatGPT on a test basis just to see what it does, but only insofar as doing fairly vanilla things like, could it write me a new and more interesting bio? Could we use it for some generic bits of marketing, which is always, the hell of trying to come up with 400 words when ChatGPT can do it for you and you can amend it. So I must emphasise that its use when it comes to things like drafting of legal documents, etc., is limited for the reason that it isn't secure. And that's the main thing I just wanted to raise here, is that unless you are paying for and developing your own version of a secure AI platform, which some law firms have done. I think Arlen Overy have got their own AI bot that they've developed that can help them with providing legal services. Only then could you potentially use that to deliver legal services on a confidential basis. So we certainly wouldn't be using the open source, open free-for-all ChatGPT to be able to do that, because it is not secure, it is not private, and then if you're putting on information that is confidential or commercially sensitive or contains personal data, it's not a secure channel to be doing that. So just bear that in mind before you ask it to go and come up with a business plan and proposal for you for your next big new idea, that you are not necessarily sharing it with a private entity. So there's that aspect which needs to be borne in mind quite carefully. But the other issue this week, of course, is that, yes, we now have this new version of ChatGPT, even more powerful, even more flexible, currently only there for people who are paying, but you can imagine at some point that might work its way down to being the version that is commercially available. So bear in mind that the version of ChatGPT you might know and love, that you've started to use within the last few weeks or months, it will evolve, it will change, and it will get more powerful, and it will retain even more information and use it in different ways. So just think quite carefully about what purposes you are considering using, and indeed are using, ChatGPT for when it comes to your business practices.
Thanks, Peter. So that was our last discussion for this episode. But if you'd like to hear more from us, please feel free to subscribe to our newsletter where you can receive information about premium subscriber only podcasts, webinars and events. And this can be done via our Patreon channel using the links in the show notes. A big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this podcast. And if you would like to produce your own podcast or webinar, or you're interested to hear more about Anson Evaluate services, please look at their website that you can find at www.ansonevaluate.com. Just to let you know, these episodes are available on our website, our YouTube channel, podcast channels as well, such as Spotify and Apple Music, Amazon and Google Podcasts. Please feel free to also leave us a review. And finally, if you have any questions about what we've talked about today, please feel free to drop us an email at admin@digitallawuk.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again next week.